All right, I'm back live, but I have lost my entire audience. But I wonder if maybe people can hear me now. There's no way to know. Let's see if I can share this link on social media and get some people in here. We've got one person. That's a start. We lost our entire audience due to audio, but can you hear me? How's the audio working? Hello, Xavier. All right, we can hear you. Awesome. In that case, welcome to round 2 of our first effort at a stream. Now, to be totally honest with you guys, I have never done anything live like this before, so you're going to be here through a bit of experimentation. But the idea is to develop a skill set that I can use to start scheduling these things more often so that we can talk to you about questions that you might have about our content or about defense technology in general. On a frequent basis, maybe like every Friday before a video goes up or right after, we can do a Q&A. But before I can do any of that, I need to learn how to work this stuff. And as you already saw, I'm doing a great job of screwing it up. Now, I've got some stuff prepared for me to discuss. I'd be happy, especially right now, to talk about some hypersonic weapons or the new SIAW missile, because I'm working on a story about it right now. But I want to also ask if you guys have any questions in the chat. I am happy to address them. Thank you genuinely for the kind words that you guys are posting in the chat right now. I'm feeling awfully vulnerable doing this live without, research available. So I really, really appreciate the support. The last 2 channels that you were on, Mover and the Ready Room, say that they don't like that I know about the Joint Strike Fighter, and they don't. I'm on the F-35 program. Honestly, Matt, that's my favorite part about interacting with you guys, is that not only are there a bunch of defense technology nerds and aviation nerds in the audience, but there's a bunch of subject matter experts who really know their stuff. And my favorite thing in the world is learning something new. So if you've got something that you want to put into the conversation that maybe I don't know, that would make my day. I definitely wouldn't be upset. Joshua, thank you so much for saying that you love my videos. Same thing, Veteran Kamikaze. Thank you so much. You guys are rad, genuinely. I really wanted to write for a living from the first day I learned to write. I remember in 3rd grade writing fan fiction for the X-Files. And I started out as a journalist because it was sort of a method to get to writing. It was the writing I wanted to do. And over the years, I've really fallen in love with this line of work. And that is genuinely because of you guys. I think I saw a question about the F-22 modernization program. So maybe I'll start out with that. So the F-22 is undergoing an $11 billion modernization effort right now. And not all of it has publicly disclosed, but it's really sort of assumed that a lot of that modernization effort is going to go towards the NGAD effort, the next generation air dominance aircraft that will replace the NGAD in the coming years. But some of the most important things that may well come out of that F-22 modernization effort include an IRST or infrared search and track capability and a helmet mounted or a helmet cued targeting system. And to be honest with you, those 2 systems alone would make the F-22 pretty difficult to match for another 15 years, if you ask me. But again, because of production volume, we still do need a replacement. The guy on Millennium 7 had a video on Russia running out of missiles for the 9th time. It would be interesting to hear Sandboxx News' view on the subject. How much do they have left? That's a great question. And to be honest with you, nobody has a concrete answer. What we do know is that Russia has limitations both on the capacity they had to start this war and on their production capacity today. And to be honest, the more advanced and capable the weapon is, the more strained their production capacity is. We actually have a video up right here on Sandboxx News about how evidence really suggests that the KH-47M2 Kinzhal is just chock full of Western hardware, particularly in the guidance system. But that's not specific to the Kinzhal. That's pretty much all modern and advanced, highly precise Russian weapons rely on Western microchips and hardware, which makes them far more difficult now to build than they used to be. So Russia's production capacity is inhibited, but I want to make sure people remember that they still have tons of dumb bombs laying around. Russia has got a lot of firepower, and it does have the bomber numbers to lay waste to huge swaths of Ukraine if that were their intention. But the truth is, they would lose a ton of bombers in the process, and it wouldn't really help them achieve their strategic goals. And that's really why they're not doing it. But they do have tons of firepower left over. Specific numbers are tough to narrow down, but the longer this war goes, the more difficult it'll be for them to field precision weapons. Love the channel. What do I know about the chrome coating? That's a great question. For those who aren't familiar, there are a lot of pictures floating around of F-22 Raptors, F-35s, stealth aircraft flying with what looks like a chrome coating, a mirrored coating. Now, some people have argued that mirrored coating might have something to do with trying to limit laser detectability and targeting, which is feasible. Others have posited that it might be that ceramic-based radar-absorbent coating, which would be a game changer for stealth aircraft. For those who aren't familiar with radar-absorbent materials or coating, the ones we use today are polymer-based, and they're rated to absorb upwards of 80% of inbound radar waves, but they are super vulnerable to damage from things like friction and heat. And as a result, they become a limiting factor in the performance of stealth aircraft. So if we could transition to a ceramic-based rather than a polymer-based radar-absorbent material, not only would it really reduce the maintenance requirements for stealth aircraft, but it would allow stealth aircraft to fly much faster. The F-22 Raptor has a stated top speed of Mach 2.25. It's probably faster than that. But we could build a stealth fighter that's even faster than that if we didn't have to worry about damage to radar-absorbent materials. Can I comment on the A-10 for Ukraine as a missile and anti-radiation platform in addition to the F-16? I'll be honest, this may not be that popular a sentiment, but I don't think that the A-10 would do Ukraine a great deal of good. It is not a particularly survivable platform. It is a slow, low-flying aircraft that's designed to be operated, in pretty uncontested airspace. We actually originally designed the A-10 to contest a Russian invasion of the Suwalki Gap in Europe, which basically is it's a narrow point in Europe that could result in a really rapid Russian sort of overwhelming NATO defenses separating Poland from the Baltic states. And the idea of the A-10 wasn't really to stop them. It was to make it costly while NATO sort of stood up a response force. The idea was never for the A-10 to be all that survivable, but in the end of the world, it would be a pretty effective tool. And that's still sort of the case today. The A-10 has more value for the United States than it does for Ukraine because of its ability to ferry and launch more modern standoff weapons, which Ukraine doesn't really have at their disposal right now. Do you think the DoD will restart the X-47 stealth drone back into production since the replicator program is online? That's an awesome question. I think the answer is no. We're far more likely, I think, at this stage to see the MQ-25 Stingray sort of adapted for a variety of roles. The Stingray right now is being built to be a drone refueler, a carrier-based drone refueler. But the truth is, it's using external tanks for that. You could really mount munitions on it, use it as a reconnaissance platform, and all sorts of other stuff. So I think we're more likely to see the MQ-25 adopt new jobs as time goes on than we are to see a whole bunch of other carrier-capable drones roll out in the very near future. But as I'm sure I'll say lots of times in this stream and every stream, never say never, right? What's my opinion on the Taurus and its possibilities in Ukraine? Real talk, I think I'd need to read a bit more on what capabilities the Taurus levers as opposed to other cruise missiles that they already have in theater, like the Storm Shadow. Likewise, even non-cruise missiles, but other long-range weapons that they've got either have or are about to have, like the ATACMS. Knowing what I do offhand about the Taurus, I think that like any long-range cruise missile, it could provide a lot of value because what Ukraine really needs, especially for well-defended targets, is volume of fires, more so than a small number of precision and very expensive platforms. Please do these streams more often. You got it. If you guys think this is going well, I'm having a good time answering questions. Could you use the A-10 to lob rockets like the Russians are doing with helos? Yeah, absolutely. And the A-10 could potentially have plenty of use cases in Ukraine, but it's always a question of that cost-benefit analysis or measuring the return on investment. As reliable as the A-10 can be and as little maintenance as it does require, it still does require maintenance. You can operate it from austere airfields, but there's a lot of infrastructure associated with maintaining an aircraft like this, and that comes with a lot of cost. So you have to decide, are you better off allocating that money toward maybe more F-16 infrastructure, or are you better off sort of parsing it out between an A-10 and the F-16? And at this juncture, I think it makes more sense to emphasize the F-16 because it can do a much broader variety of jobs than it does to sort of split the money. Thanks for the content you've produced. Thank you so much for the $5. That really genuinely means a ton. The long-form interviews and podcasts are excellent. Can't wait for Hermeus to get off the ground. I am immensely excited about Hermeus's first test flight. I've got a couple of books here just because they're written by friends of mine, so I figured I'd try to plug them. And Don Bentley's book, Weapons Grade, which we've talked about on this channel a few times now, they devote a whole section of the book to the aircraft in the book Corvair, which is loosely based on Hermeus's Dark Horse, whether Don Bentley meant it to be or not, talking about it eclipsing the SR-71's records. And I genuinely believe that even if Hermeus doesn't manage to sort of broach that hypersonic barrier this year, they will very likely exceed the SR-71's records in terms of a reusable air-breathing aircraft. Now, to be clear, scramjet powered, the X-43 and other platforms have gone much faster, but they weren't reusable. Thank you so much, Creature, I think, for that 99 cents. I really appreciate it. Could you use old airframes like A4s as single-use pilotless drones for air supremacy, or is the tech still not quite there? And also, thank you, the B Knight 3. And honestly, thank you to everybody who's been asking questions. I'll try to get to as many as I can. And yeah, we absolutely could make platforms like the A4 or even dated F-16s into drones. And there have been a number of efforts to do so already. One that a lot of you are almost certainly familiar with are the QF-16, which are sort of target F-16s that are remotely piloted. But the truth is, it's a matter of just devising a system that you can plug and play into these older platforms that you can then use for either remote piloting, which is a bit more labor intensive on the technology, or for automated piloting, which might be a bit less technologically labor intensive, but it requires much better automation software. Now, the idea here would be to be able to field like a whole large volume of these aircraft all at once. But the truth is, it would sort of be cheaper to field smaller, more cost-effective drones for the same job, because even if you're not putting a pilot in this F-16 or F-4 or A-4, you still have to pay for all the maintenance and operational infrastructure required of those aircraft. So in a World War III scenario, I think we could probably do it, but in terms of preparing or deterring conflict, I think it makes more sense to invest in production infrastructure and try to field a large volume of, less expensive to maintain and operate platforms that are even more capable. Have I tried DCS? There's a video on Ukrainian pilots training in a sim environment, and I'm pretty sure it was DCS. Your opinion? So I haven't tried DCS for a couple of reasons. The first one being that I'm a dad, and it is really tough for me. Maybe dads of older kids get more time to play video games. My daughter's 5, and I work a lot. Not because Sandboxx is mean to me. I just really love my job. So if I'm not at this desk, I am almost certainly in my daughter's bedroom or the living room, hiding under the dining room table, one of those places, chasing my kiddo around because, like, as cheesy as it sounds, she genuinely is the most important thing to me. But after she goes to bed, I tend to go back to research. When I don't, I do play a lot of Ace Combat 7, which is the least realistic game ever, but you can jump in for 10 minutes and blow up a bunch of airplanes. I've got the PlayStation VR, so I fly a lot of F-22 sorties in Ace Combat. But I'm really stoked about trying out Starfield once my wife finally lets me get on the Xbox. She is the avid gamer in my family. Let's see here. Joshua, thank you so much for that $10. What are your thoughts on the Navy returning to the KC-130 as the Tacamo aircraft and the possibility of refueling on carriers as motivation for change? Well, as luck would have it, thank you for crediting my work-life balance. It's not as good as it might sound. I actually have an article about the new KC-130 Tacamo aircraft coming out in Popular Mechanics. If it hasn't come out yet, it'll come out soon. Thank you very much, Octavio. That's really nice of you. So I think that it's actually it's very logical. The E6B is a very capable platform that's way faster, obviously, than the C-130 platform. But by using the KC-130, you can deploy these aircraft from a way wider variety of platforms, austere airfields, and to your point, off of aircraft carriers, as we saw James Flatley do decades ago. And when I interviewed Admiral Flatley about flying the C-130 off of aircraft carriers, he was very clear that it would be easier today off of a Nimitz or a Ford-class carrier than it was back when he did it. And in fact, he's pretty confident that they could operate 3 or 4 or more C-130s simultaneously off of these flat tops. Is that something that we'll see? Probably not likely unless there's a really genuine need for it, because there's cheaper ways to get stuff onto an aircraft carrier. But for things like the Tacamo mission set, which if you're not familiar with, is sort of literally flying in looping circles with a 2+ mile antenna hanging out the back of the aircraft, broadcasting very low frequency radio waves to deep below the sea to where submarines, ballistic missile submarines can get them. Regular radio waves don't penetrate seawater very effectively because it's so conductive. And as a result, really only very low frequency radio waves can. Now we've got 4 or 5 VLF antenna arrays, massive arrays. They're sometimes measured in kilometers that we use to communicate with America's fleet of ballistic missile submarines. But if a nuclear war were to kick off, those arrays would be among the first targets for sure. And as a result, we would be reliant on these Tacamo aircraft to communicate with these ballistic missile subs. And I think the KC-130 is a much more logical platform to do it with than a runway queen like the E-6B. Why aren't there stealth missiles? Believe it or not, destruction, there are. The AGM-158 JASSM, Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, and the JASSM-ER, the long-range anti-ship missile, all the weapons in the AGM-158 family, and a whole bunch more actually do incorporate stealth technology. In fact, the AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile that's entered service in the 80s, I want to say, might even be a bit older than that, was built using a lot of lessons learned from the Quiet Bird, which was arguably the first ever stealth aircraft in development. It was being developed back in 1962 and 63 for the Army of all branches. But when they didn't really see the value in it, they took what they learned from the Quiet Bird and incorporated it into the AGM-86. So truth be told, cruise missiles have been leveraging stealth design elements for decades now. I wish I could eat potatoes in the military. Wait, I can do that as an Irishman. I agree. Kaz, thank you so much for that $10. Genuinely, that means the world. I want you guys to know that this money doesn't go to me personally, despite how grateful I am. It goes to Sandboxx News, which allows me to employ a whole group of subject matter experts. Some of these guys are the reason why I come off as well-informed. It's because we've got Navy SEALs, CIA officers, award-winning defense journalists, Green Berets, Hazard Lee, the F-35 pilot, many of you are probably familiar with, has written a lot of articles for us. And the money that we take in for Sandboxx News is what goes toward hiring out those writers and being able to produce this content. So I want to make sure that you guys know that I'm not taking this money and running. It doesn't even come to my bank account. It goes straight into Sandboxx News's coffers. I should make a video on the Air Tractor 802. It's a very cool platform. I love the idea of dispersed air support because of the tyranny of distance. So I agree. I'll have to put it on my list. Bruce Dog only found my channel a few months ago, but I'm loving the content. That means the world. Thank you, genuinely. JC the Music Man, thank you. The fact that I get to do this is a dream come true. And despite the fact that I've been doing it for years now, not a day goes by where I don't remember my days as an HR manager for a defense contractor and being absolutely miserable because I am the worst HR guy you can imagine. Tacamo, take charge and move out. You nailed it, Matt. Thank you, Van, for saying you always look forward to my episodes. I love to do this. Could C-130s loaded with Rapid Dragon missile pallets start from a carrier? So this is one of those questions where there's the right answer is yeah. Absolutely. The C-130 can absolutely operate from aircraft carriers, but the practical answer is that it's somewhat unlikely, just because there are other ways to do it that are a bit less dangerous, a bit less labor intensive. But again, in a really extreme situation, it's absolutely possible. What do I think of the V-22 crash in Australia back in August? I think that the V-22 Osprey is suffering from the fact that it is the first tilt rotor aircraft in active service. And I think that if you go back and look at, stories about the UH-60, the H-60 series Black Hawk, when it first entered service, it did suffer fewer problems, but it suffered enough problems for a ton of media blowback. And I think that we're seeing the same with the V-22. There's a bit of recency bias here. It is tragic anytime we lose service members, but military aviation is an inherently dangerous enterprise. And if we don't work these problems out, we'll have to just give up on the idea of tilt rotor aircraft. And the premise has got so much promise that it just doesn't make a ton of sense. Holy crap, Mark, $100. That is, thank you. I spent a few years of my life writing articles for less than that. Genuinely, man, thank you very much. Keep at it, Alex. Love your work. Don't worry about the lack of data. You only need to know 1% more than your audience. Although I suspect 1,000% more, 10,000% more. I really appreciate that. The only thing that separates me from you guys is the fact that I get to research for a living. And I've got a Rolodex full of people that I can call to ask hard questions of. And the reason why I'm able to do it for a living, and the reason why I have that Rolodex, is because you guys watch and read my work, and that gives my work credibility. I try to produce credible work, but it's the audience that really gives my work credibility. And that's the reason why people take my call. And I really, really appreciate it. Thank you so much, William, for that $10. Thank you, Joshua, for that $5. Thank you, DE, for $2. I don't want to miss anybody I want to make sure I thank everybody who's given me some money, but don't think you have to. Thoughts on Boeing's latest anti-hypersonic tech from Ben with $10. I really, really appreciate that. So this is a tough question because the details of these counter-hypersonic technologies are rather limited, but I do think that we're rapidly approaching a point in which hypersonic weapons might not necessarily have the punch that they do today. But the truth is, missile defense in general is just significantly harder than most people tend to give it credit for. So even if you have a very, very effective counter-hypersonic defense system, that's still no guarantee of intercept. The same way an extremely effective air defense system today is no guarantee of intercepting maybe a subsonic cruise missile, for instance. It's just the nature of missile defense is, trying to shoot a bullet with a bullet, except both bullets can maneuver. It's really, really difficult. If you're not familiar with Habitual Line Crosser here on YouTube and also on TikTok and Instagram, I highly recommend it. He's an MIM 104 Patriot operator maintainer. He's also an instructor at their schoolhouse, and he puts out awesome content about air defense. I can't recommend enough. I still use a Rolodex. I don't, but I still talk like it's the 50s. The Lancer's still a viable platform. Why would they want to retire it? I actually have a personal story about this. A few years ago, I was touring a GE military aviation facility that I couldn't take pictures in because it was a classified facility, despite the fact that the equipment they were using was decades old. And the problem with the B-1B Lancer is that the infrastructure designed to make parts for it and maintain it were all designed decades ago. And as a result, a single turbine blade for the B-1B Lancer's engine, which I could hold in my hand while I was at the factory, ran the government north of $100,000 for just one blade in the turbine. And a lot of that cost was associated with the fact that GE had to keep people on staff who knew how to work these ancient machines that were not online 11 months out of the year, and maybe 1 month out of the year, they'd power it up and use it to produce some parts. And other than that, it was just taking up space. And as a result, the costs associated with it were just immense. So platforms like the B-1B are rapidly aging to a point where getting replacement parts isn't cost effective anymore. And it just makes more sense to field new platforms that are cheaper to get new parts for. Now, the B-21 Raider is a highly capable platform, but it will be subsonic as far as we know. It would be crazy for it to be supersonic, which means America will lose its heavy payload supersonic capabilities. But to be totally honest, we haven't found a use case that is pivotal for supersonic heavy payload bombers in recent years. That's not to say that we won't learn 3 to 6 months into a conflict with, let's say, China, that, man, we really could use some heavy payload supersonic bombers. Maybe at that point, we'll pull some B-1s out of the boneyard. But right now, it seems as though there's more value in being sneaky than there is in being fast, despite my concerns about the tyranny of distance. Let's see, Alex, why not just paint the F-15, F-16, F-18 with new ceramic RAM and call it a day? Once we are able to field this ceramic radar absorbent materials in, a fielded and functional way, that'll absolutely happen. We already do coat, many F-16s in particular, the Have Glass F-16s for the Wild Weasel mission. We already do coat a lot of these fourth generation aircraft in polymer-based radar absorbent materials. But again, there's a cost benefit trade-off there. Some, operations just really don't require stealth, or even, you really want to advertise your presence as for a deterrent value. And the increased costs associated with maintaining that radar absorbent coating isn't always necessarily there. It's not always necessarily all that valuable. Do I think John Boyd was credible? Ooh, hot question. John Boyd and the fighter mafia. So John Boyd, I think if you're an aviation nerd like me, John Boyd is sort of either the Hunter S. Thompson or maybe the Charles Bukowski to, make a parallel to being an aspiring writer. Every aspiring writer goes through a stage where they love Hunter S. Thompson, right? And then you might grow out of it and find him to be a bit tiresome as you get older, or you might stay there. I think people age out of HST into Charles Bukowski. John Boyd is sort of the Hunter S. Thompson of aviation. He had some hard opinions that a lot of people still ascribe to. I tend to take a pretty nuanced approach to everything. I'm not a believer and not a pound for air to ground, but I'm also not a big fan of platforms that are so broadly multi-role that they become too expensive to operate in volume. And that's something, we talked about that in this last week, or maybe it'll be this coming week's episode of AirPower. They're getting mixed up in my brain. But the idea that it takes 60,000 plus man hours today to build a single F-35C, whereas back in World War II, it took about 12,000 hours to build an F-4U that would have operated from carriers. And that creates a deficit when we need to replace airframes in a large-scale fight. So by having exquisite, expensive multi-role platforms, we add to the man hours required to replace an airframe, and that can be a real problem in a big fight. But, all things in nuance, only Sith deal in absolutes. I think that John Boyd had a really hard stance that was very well suited in some things, and it helped produce the F-16, which is one of the most broadly capable, fourth generation fighters in history. But I think if John Boyd saw what the F-16 became, I don't think he'd like it. So, I think like learning martial arts, if you're into MMA, you should take the elements of Brazilian jiu-jitsu that work for you, and then take the elements of Muay Thai that work for you and incorporate them both into your approach rather than ascribing to one, discipline and ignoring the rest. Bearing in mind the emphasis NGAD scene. Oh, I lost it. I'm sorry. Sorry, it scrolled down on me, but I'll move to this question here from Jordo. Thank you for the $5. It seems the U.S. Air Force can't really shoot as far as it can see, in a manner of speaking. Are incoming missile designs similar, comparable to, say, Meteor? Great question. The answer is yes. So the Meteor air-to-air missile, it's a European-based air-to-air missile. And what makes it so potent as a long-range weapon isn't necessarily its maximum range. I think we get a little too hung up on max range. Max range in an air-to-air missile includes a great deal of coasting time. So let's say you're trying to hit a target that's more than 100 miles away. It means that the missile is going to travel under power for a certain amount of distance. And if the target is way further than that distance, it will climb under power so that it can then coast down toward the target once it's no longer under power, but moving forward at a very high speed. Now, the Meteor carries a rocket ramjet on board that allows it to sort of throttle its rocket burn, and that lets it travel under power for a greater distance. So the Meteor, its real claim to fame, I would contend, isn't necessarily how far it can reach, but its hit accuracy, its likelihood of a hit at 70 miles. Because outside of 70 miles, we're really pushing it when you're aiming at a fighter. They're extremely maneuverable. But the Meteor can continue to change direction as far out as 70 miles. And that is a huge deal that makes it, in my opinion, far more dangerous than the AMRAAM or any of the Chinese missiles that have been fielded to date. However, the AIM-260, the Joint Air Terminal, the JATM, I'm blanking on it now, it's said to come with a range that's double that of the AMRAAM. Now, the AMRAAM's publicly disclosed range is about 100 miles, but it's well understood that the United States understates the maximum range of its air-to-air missiles. A year or so back, the U.S. Air Force announced that an F-15C scored the longest range air-to-air kill against a target drone using an AMRAAM. They didn't disclose the range. I think it's possible the Meteor will come with a 200-mile range, which is bonkers. But again, to your point about not being able to shoot as far as it can see, you need to have good, reliable target data as far out as 200 miles for that to have any value. And that's not necessarily always a given. Let's see. I said I would end at 4:30, but let's go a bit longer so I can answer a few more of these questions. Thanks for the Moon Man here. The Rocket Lab's last failure. Will the hypersonic program HASTE be impacted? And have you done anything on that? I haven't done anything on the HASTE program. I'll have to add it to my list. I think it's very important to understand with all of these failures, first and foremost, that we're sort of comparing America's very real testing apparatus to the Instagram reel of some of these adversary nations. And this comes up again when it comes to readiness rates with the F-35 as a great example. So we're seeing, Russia and China put these hypersonic weapons into service. Russia's Avant-Garde has only seen, according to Russia, 2 tests, and both were successful. According to the United States, there's good intelligence to suggest that there was a 3rd test and the 3rd one was a failure, and Russia doesn't disclose failures. America's AGM-183 Arrow, on the other hand, had 3 successful tests in 1 year and still got canceled. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. One is just, a rigorous bar for testing, but the other is that America's fielding conventionally armed hypersonic weapons, and there are more than 70 hypersonic missile programs in active development right now, and a lot of them are intertwined in some really fundamental ways. And as a result, progress on one program results in progress in others. And there's a big difference between a failure that produces information that can improve your system and a failure that can't. So as long as we're failing in ways that we learn from, I'm not really all that concerned about hypersonic testing failures. My bigger concern is how infrequent our hypersonic tests are. And a lot of that has to do with a limited infrastructure. Dan Lewis, yes, I love it. I appreciate Sandboxx chiming in with a link for the Sandboxx magazine. You can subscribe to it now and get 10% off your first issue. And the first issue includes an article I wrote from my interview with Hazard Lee, who's the author of The Art of Clear Thinking. You guys are probably familiar with his YouTube channel. Hazard's an awesome guy. I've known him for years now. He's taught me a ton. In fact, we're trying to put together a trip for me to go out there and visit him with my kiddo at some point in the near future, now that he's a dad too. Let's see. I'm not sure why ceramic RAM would be reflective. Oh man, I keep scrolling and losing stuff. I'm really sorry. Has the ceramic RAM CRAM system ever shot down an actual enemy aircraft, or is it not suited for that? Just curious, been a big fan. I really appreciate that. I'm not familiar with a CRAM ever taking down an aircraft, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. The real value of the CRAM, though, is for engaging things like rockets, short-range weapons that could do a great deal of damage if they get there. The CRAM isn't super valuable against larger platforms or missiles. For instance, a ballistic missile or a hypersonic missile, the CRAM would just sort of turn one weapon into a shotgun blast, still traveling at Mach 20. It's a bit better, but not necessarily better. When I saw Russia shoot down its own planes, it was an S-300. I immediately thought of your discussion on the U.S. aircraft having a transponder that prevents aircraft from shooting down friendly aircraft. Now, the U.S. has had some friendly fire incidents with aircraft, but it's been, more than 2 decades. The U.S. Patriot system shot down one American fighter, as well as, I believe, a British Tornado, I think. And at the time, it was because the Patriot system was set to automatic. We basically told it, here's what threats might look like. If you see one, shoot it down. And as a result, it identified 2 aircraft that seemed like threats, but were actually friendly platforms. So now there's always a user. There's always an operator in the loop who can make that fire or don't fire decision. And to your point, we've come a long way in terms of that friendly versus not friendly transponder. So the chances of a friendly fire incident are slimmer now. And when you look at, for instance, how complex the air campaign in Desert Storm was, you can really see just how intricate the planning has to be for this stuff to work. But the United States and NATO as a whole is constantly working on this friendly versus non-friendly aircraft deconflicting complex airspace problem. And I think that there are very few nations in the world that can do it as well as the US and its allies. What do you think? What do you think Lockheed Martin is teasing in their latest short? Okay, so Lockheed has been pushing a lot of things lately, in particular their NGAD, or Next Generation Air Dominance, and potentially the SR-72 or whatever else it might be called. We've talked about this on this channel in the past, where the SR-72 was a publicly disclosed developmental program for years and years, between 2013 and 2018. And then on March 1st of 2018, Vladimir Putin announced Kinzhal, which he claimed was the first modern hypersonic weapon, was going into service. And Lockheed stripped any mention of the SR-72 off their website and stopped talking about it. Back in January of 2018, I remember covering one of Lockheed's VPs talking about the SR-72 as though it was a real aircraft that could already fly, but now it's missing. So there's a chance that they are, if not pushing the fact that this aircraft exists, they're trying to create some pressure on the DoD to fund its development because they seem confident that they can build it. But in particular, right now, Lockheed Martin wants to secure that Next Generation Air Dominance contract. It is a license to print money for many years to come. It won't be as lucrative a contract as the F-35 was, because the F-35's contract was really, really poorly executed. So the Air Force has learned a lot from the acquisition debacle that was the F-35, but NGAD is still, it represents a whole boatload of money that Lockheed has really got its sight set on. Let's see. Hypersonic is bull. It's easier to shoot down than a Storm Shadow because hypersonic is way less flexible in its flight path. Now, this could be true in some instances. Basically, a predictable hypersonic missile is just a ballistic missile. Ballistic missiles have been traveling at hypersonic speeds since the V-2 rocket back in the 40s. What separates a hypersonic missile from a missile that just travels at hypersonic speeds is that ability to maneuver. But it's not just about maneuvering a lot. It's about being strategic in the way in which you do maneuver. The whole idea is to try to predict when the air defense system that you're competing against comes up with a target formula to try to launch a missile of its own, an interceptor, to hit your missile at exactly the right time, at exactly the right point in their trajectory. So optimally, you would change course just after that interceptor was launched, or maybe a bit before it, so that with your closing rate, you can close with your target before that system has the ability to recalculate your new trajectory and then launch another interceptor that can close with it. So being able to maneuver is important, but to your point, it can't maneuver that much, right? So the whole point here is to really find the right time and exactly the right amount to change trajectory so that you can sort of render those calculations moot. All right, I'll answer one last question here. I'll just pick one at random before I sign off for the day. Guys, thank you so much for chiming in here, for giving me these awesome questions. You know, this was just meant to be a test run to see if I could do this. I feel pretty good about how this has gone. I would love your feedback. If you want to send me messages on Twitter or, right on here in the comments, I'd really appreciate it. Let me know what you think of how this was and what I could do better. I always want to try to do better, but I'll pick one last question here at random. Do you think we need more than one SBX floating radar, giving everything in the Pacific? I personally think so. Now, that's an interesting question. The answer is tough to come up with because we don't actually know the extent of America's missile and aviation defense apparatus in the Pacific. We don't know all of the resources and assets that are actually being leveraged to that end. For instance, we know that China is trying to field satellites that can actively monitor the entirety of the South China Sea. We don't know if they have yet. We don't know if they had years ago or if they won't for another 10 years. And likewise with the United States. So I would always err on the side of more observational capability, more targeting capability. But without knowing really what we have in theater, it's tough to say that we're running short. I'll do one more. Let's. Well, those of us on current programs cannot have intrusive accounts from TikTok, IG, so we're limited in communication. I absolutely understand that. I genuinely do, and that's why I try to sort of meet people on the platforms that they prefer as much as I can. So I guess I'll leave it at that. But one more time, I just want to genuinely thank you guys for chiming in today and for watching my content in the first place. Again, I get to do this because you guys watch, and this is my dream job. So I'm genuinely appreciative. The rest of my team at Sandboxx News is appreciative. And Sandboxx, the company, which if you're not familiar with, has the Sandboxx letter service that supports service members in basic training. We also have the Sandboxx magazine at sandboxx.us/magazine and a bunch of other stuff going on. I am one small piece of the Sandboxx sort of enterprise, and your support really means the world to me. Thank you guys, and I will see you again very soon.